To our monthly webinar series. I'm Rebecca Schendel. I'm Managing Director of the Center, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session today. I will say there's professional reasons why I'm looking forward to this session, but also a real personal pleasure for me to welcome Tejendra Pherali and Marie Lall to the Center. For those of you who may not know, before I joined the BC staff 2 years ago, I worked as a colleague of Marie's and Tejendra's at the Center for Education and It's been a long time. You see, the Center for Education and International Development at University College London Institute of Education. Both Tejendra and Marie are still there. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome them and to have them come speak with us all about their research. So just for those of you who are new to our webinar series, the way that we tend to run this hour is we have about 20 minutes of presentation, and then we try to leave about 40 minutes open for questions and answers. We ask you to please mute yourself and to leave your camera off. That allows us to all be able to see the speaker while they're speaking, and then also to send your questions via the chat function. And you can do that throughout the presentations. You don't have to wait until Tejendra and Marie are finished speaking to send your questions. You can do them as they come, and I will corral those questions and moderate the discussion later in the session. So without further ado, let me introduce our two presenters, and then we'll get started. So first of all, Tejendra Pherali is Associate Professor in Education and International Development at UCL IOE, where Tejendra leads the Education, Conflict, and Peace Building research theme within the center. Tejendra's research focuses on education in conflict-affected contexts. He's worked in a large number of countries, including Afghanistan, Lebanon, Somalia, and his native Nepal. And we're thrilled to have Tejendra with us today. Marie Lall is Professor of Education and South Asian Studies at UCL IOE. Marie's a South Asia expert. She specializes in the intersections between politics and education. And in addition to really extensive scholarly research in this area, Marie also has extensive experience working on education policy in India, Pakistan, and Myanmar. And we look forward to hearing her insights from that perspective today as well. She also formerly served as UCL's Pro-Vice Chancellor, excuse me, that would be interesting, wouldn't it, Marie? Pro-Vice Provost for South Asia until November 2018. So I'm delighted to have them both with us today. I'm going to stop sharing this holding slide and turn it over to Tejendra to get us started.
Okay, so thanks very much, Rebecca, for inviting us to this seminar. And it's really nice to be able to reconnect with you, which is great. So, so we had the pleasure of working together for a few years when you were with us. So in my presentation, I will be talking about 3 dimensions of education, higher education, and conflict, or particularly sort of looking at how higher education can contribute to peace building in the context which have been affected by violent conflict. So I'll talk a little bit about the conceptual interconnections between higher education and conflict, and then we'll talk a little bit about this idea of partnership and collaboration between the northern institutions and the institutions in conflict-affected contexts. And then finally, I'll try to draw upon some of the work that I've done on higher education in Somaliland, a collaborative project between the 2 universities, one in Somaliland and the UCL Institute of Education, and try to present some of the pathways to impact through higher education for peace building more generally. So just to kind of start with some of the conceptual ideas in the field of higher education and conflict, we know that higher education is plays an important role in providing vital, acting as a point of critical reflection on national development, not only economically, but also socially, culturally, and intellectually. The availability and provision of tertiary education also incentivize motivations for completing primary and secondary education, particularly for refugee children who can envision the continuous progression in their learning and educational achievements, with some clear pathways to recognized qualifications, enabling them to secure stable livelihoods. Notably, education can also fuel conditions of conflict by unevenly distributing access and quality across regions and social groups, reproducing existing socioeconomic inequalities, promoting biased history, repressing minority languages and cultures, and most importantly, excluding minorities and refugee populations from access to quality learning. And higher education can equally serve as a mechanism of elite closure, a key tool in the maintenance of elite power, a reproducer of colonial hegemony and dominance. These features are manifested through stringent admissions criteria in universities, dominance of upper class students in higher education, and the tendency to import Western models characterized by neoliberal policies. Refugee learners' experience in higher education could be limited due to their unfamiliarity with the system and pedagogical processes that are divorced from educational, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds of refugee learners, as well as sort of adverse social and economic environments in host countries. Higher education can also serve as a space of silence. Rote learning and memorization, could be the pedagogical limitations in relation to really transforming thinking. And it can become a place of alienation and victimization if certain groups of students, because of their legal status, cultural, ethnic, or racial backgrounds, are continuously sort of marginalized in a complex structural sort of arrangement of the higher education system. And it can equally serve as a place for false hope and frustration because of the lack of opportunities or equitable access to opportunity, for all graduates in the society. Now, particularly looking at the complex interactions between higher education and conflict, if you look at the educational development initiatives in conflict-affected contexts, higher education is broadly a low priority. However, after the conflict ends, there is a significant growth in demand in higher education in post-war societies. And there are a number of sort of thinking, ways of thinking about how higher education can relate to development and also, peaceful transformation. So firstly, university students and academics are often at the forefront of violent movements and therefore usually disperse during conflict, and as they either participate in or are forced to flee the conflict, as you would see in the context of Syrian conflict. In a huge number of academics and higher education students have been forced to flee. The post-war demobilization should involve strategies for bringing them back to employment through a relevant vocational or higher education training. So secondly, higher education serves as a critical space for knowledge production and engagement in a plurality of political views, which can both ameliorate and fuel political tensions. Thirdly, the post-conflict reconstruction of higher education without concurrently addressing ethnic, gender-based, and social dimensions that undermine equity of access and quality can facilitate the return of conflict. So higher education in recent years has been argued to serve as a catalyst for stabilization and securitization, reconstruction, state building, and peace building. So Samson Milton and Sultan Barakat have done some work around this. And the expansion of higher education provisions in conflict-affected contexts can provide hope for a stable livelihood for young people and reduce the likelihood of relapse into conflict. So moreover, investment in this area enhances the prospects of reconstruction in post-war periods. Though not recognized prominently in mainstream peace-building studies, higher education can, and I quote Milton and Barakat here, make a constructive contribution to peace building, to rebuilding fragile states by rebuilding institutional capacity, supporting efforts to establish the rule of law and civic engagement. So by promoting the messages about consequences of violence, addressing the social, political, and economic inequalities, and engaging constructively in identity politics, higher education can support sustainable peace building. Notwithstanding analysis of attacks on higher education and approaches to rebuilding the post-war higher education sector, HE sector largely is neglected in the educational development discourse. So you can see this idea of the VPLP approach to analysis, which I developed in 2016 to look at education from multiple perspectives. So education as victim, perpetrator, liberator, and peace builder can equally be applied in the higher education sector. Now, thinking about the international partnerships for higher education, as you know that working internationally requires partnership as a necessary component nowadays, is basically a reaction against the former power asymmetry between the North and South. And there's some research around how international higher education collaborations can actually produce institutional benefits, particularly for the institutions in conflict-affected contexts in relation to building capacity, academic effectiveness, and exposing discussions to the international context in those institutions. There are particularly personal benefits in relation to academic development, cultural, economic, and strategic enhancement of individuals who are part of the collaborative initiatives. But there's a critical question around whether these collaborations are actually horizontal. There's always this North-South partnership being sort of accused of being a neo-colonial project in action, through which sort of Northern higher education approaches and ideologies and paradigms shifted to the Southern partners. And you see this higher education mess, that has been created through massive privatization and an increase in fees, and those kind of commodification approaches in higher education being exported to these higher education institutions in low-income countries, particularly in conflict-affected context. And in most cases, Northern institutions tend to be working with elite institutions in conflict-affected contexts, through their collaborative projects, without really accounting for the reproduction of existing inequalities and promoting elitism in those contexts. These partnerships are always risky, sensitive, and difficult to implement if you look at it from more technical and logistical perspectives. Another critical point around this is that these interventions are largely dependent on donor priority areas. And when the funding stops, when the donors' priorities in that particular context is diverted, these projects can end up without producing any meaningful or sustainable impact in the context. Now, how much time have I got, Rebecca?
A couple minutes, 2 minutes, maybe?
Okay, thank you. So this is my last slide. I wanted to present some of the sort of pathways to impact, that there are some domains of possibilities in collaborative initiatives between North-South or South-South collaborations. The first pathway that I propose is that a pathway through teaching capacity development, that professional development opportunities in the higher education teaching and learning are rare in institutions in conflict-affected or fragile environments. Through pedagogical and curriculum training for higher education teachers, academic partnerships can improve teaching and learning practice and produce multiplier effects by utilizing the support of Northern universities. The second pathway to impact could be through research training and experience in collaborative research. Higher education institutions in conflict-affected environments often lack in research capacities due to the devastation of research infrastructure in war. Thus, their role in community engagement, knowledge sharing, and national policy making is largely undermined. Improved research capacities of higher education staff would not only promote research-informed teaching, but also enhance their role in knowledge production and policy reforms in their countries, as well as contributing to global understandings of post-conflict education recovery. Third pathway is through and teaching exchange. South-South partnerships have the potential to promote academic synergies at regional levels. This kind of collaboration would be easier to succeed logistically and more equipped to respond to regional political, social, and economic challenges. Through collaboration in curriculum development and teaching, regional higher education institutions could develop strategic partnerships for joint research, teaching exchange between staff, as well as promote student mobility. Finally, a broad pathway through an academic program in education, conflict, and fragility, or peace building, you might want to call it. The impact through this pathway assumes that the development of integrative academic programs in education, conflict, and fragility in southern universities could help professionals scale up knowledge about the root causes of conflict and conflict-sensitive approach to their teaching, research, and policy dialogue. The development of such programs simultaneously across participating universities could further facilitate collaboration between higher education institutions and with practitioner organizations to produce a new generation of cadre that is better equipped to respond to educational needs in emergencies and protracted crises. In the long term, it might also help nuance, improve, and professionalize the field of education in emergencies. And there are obviously the benefits for both Northern institutions to be able to really understand Southern epistemologies and ways of understanding the world through engagement, but also Southern institutions can benefit through collaboration and wider outlook to respond to higher education's role that is needed in rebuilding post-conflict societies. And I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Tejendra. We will transition over to Marie. As a reminder, the sort of general theme of today is exploring the ideal and the real in conflict-affected areas. And I think you touched on some ideal and some real there, but I think Marie is going to take us into the real. So I will share my screen for you, Marie.
Thank you, and you can go straight to the second slide.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm speaking about Myanmar, and that's not an easy thing to do, given the current circumstances. But originally I was planning to sort of map out the higher education reform process on the outline that Tejendra had given, because actually there has been a massive education reform. So what I'm doing instead is I'm going to give you a bit of background on how the education reform happened, talk about higher education reform and how that sort of fits into development and Myanmar's conflict scenario, and then talk about the elections and the coup and how that's affecting higher education today. So many people think that we actually had a reform process that only started a few years ago. 2015, most people think, when the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, came into power, but actually the reform started closer to 20 years back. They started from the outside in. So Myanmar is made up of 60% ethnic Burma, which is a majority ethnic group, and about 40% different smaller ethnic groups. And many of these groups have ethnic armed groups, which have been at war with the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, for most part since independence. And it was only in the sort of early 1990s or sort of mid-1990s that there was a whole ceasefire process which allowed ethnic civil society to come in and start delivering services like education and health that the government and the state were unable to deliver. And most of that was also aimed at adults. So a lot of the education projects were aimed at adults, sort of because many the universities had been shut after the 1988 protests for a long time. And this model, which developed in the ethnic areas, was something which came to Yangon sort of post 2004, when the then head of military intelligence was taken under house arrest for on corruption charges. And at that point in time, there was a window of opportunity where civil society was able to set up services, in particular education services. And the idea of some of those key organizations, one in particular that I worked with from 2005 onwards was Myanmar Egress, was to change society from within rather than revolting against the military rule and pushing from outside. And if you go to the next slide, you will sort of see the images of some of these, next slide, yeah, some of the people who are involved both on the ethnic development of post-compulsory education and post-compulsory education for ethnic people and for the heartland Burma. In particular, on the top right-hand side, Dr. Newen Ma, who's now unfortunately passed away on his a few days before his 50th birthday, sitting with Ban Ki-moon. So he is one of the founders of Myanmar Egress, and Myanmar Egress at one point in time in about 2007, 2008 was running almost literally a small university in the backyard of a hotel in Yangon. And that is what actually supported the change process, which I'm going to talk about next. Next slide, please. So I'm going to fast forward through a transition period, which I don't have the time to talk about, between 2010 and 2015. But just to tell you a little bit about that period where one of the reforms, so there were elections in 2010, the NLD did not stand, so they boycotted, and the military-backed USDP party came into power, and the president at that time, called President Thein Sein, said he had four priorities for the country. Number one was national reconciliation between the military and the NLD, and he brought Aung San Suu Kyi back into the political process. The second one was ethnic peace, and he started a new peace process. The third one was economic reforms, and the fourth one was education reforms. And one thing which started in 2012 was the comprehensive education sector review, where the Ministry of Education was allowed to go out and literally document what was needed. It was like a needs analysis. The donor community or the aid agencies were invited to come in. Prior to that, it had only been UNICEF and JICA who had been allowed to operate with the Ministry of Education. And a new law was put in. I mean, there were many things which were done. One of the things which was done was a new education law was promulgated. And actually that didn't go down very well. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that there were massive student protests. This is not one of my photos, this is from the press, but I was actually caught up in one of those protests whilst I was in a taxi. And this is when the police got a bit violent. But actually the interesting thing of the protests in 2015 and the protests today is that in 2015, the leadership of the student-led organizations actually sat down with representatives of the Thein Sein government, and they came to a resolution on what needed to be changed in the law. So these kind of protests can be negotiated, and whilst Myanmar has a history of student protests and violent crackdowns, this was not one of them, even though this photo sort of looks pretty violent. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, 2015, we have the elections and the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party wins with a vast majority. And just focusing now on education, the thing which had come out of those 3-4 years of review was a national education strategic plan. It's actually the same document that had been put together by the previous document. It was called the sector plan, and NLD made minor changes and called it the strategic plan. But basically the aims were equity, quality, and relevance. And if you go to the next slide, please. You will see here, this is the aim of the transformational shift across all sectors. And one of the sectors is higher education, seen very much as key to more development rather than peace. I think I have to, although I started off by saying that Myanmar has been a country that has sustained 60, 70 years of conflict, ethnic conflict, this is something which is not really recognized at the heartland of government. It's something which is left to the military to deal with. So one of the things which is really interesting is that when we talk about reconciliation and peace regarding higher education. It is more about the relationship between higher education stakeholders, i.e. Academic staff and students, and the military and the former military government, rather than talking about the issues of ethnic students, because there are actually very few ethnic students who manage to get into higher education. So that's something where Myanmar hasn't quite made peace with its own conflict history. But just to say that obviously they were trying to change everything pretty much at once, and not everything worked quite so well. But I was quite involved in the higher education reform process. If you go to the next slide, the first thing was to start dealing with the ministry. So this is actually in the ministry in Naypyidaw, in Myanmar's capital, where as part of a wider UCL project, me and colleagues were delivering training for the ministerial staff on how to engage broadly with these reforms. And if you go to the next slide, we were particularly focused on higher education. So UCL colleagues and myself actually helped train the first trainers for what was going to be the National Institute for Higher Education and Development. And as part of our students, quote unquote, we had literally most of the people on the rector's committee. And the idea was to actually engage with senior academics on how they were going to run their universities that were going to become autonomous. Prior to this, you have to imagine it was extremely centralized. Whatever the ministry decided, even in terms of what was being taught in the classroom, was going to be taught, but also moving academics around. Professors generally after 3-4 years would be moved without any kind of consultation. And so you can imagine extremely difficult to actually develop research communities. So academics in Myanmar did not have the right to develop their own research agenda. This was now coming. They did not write their own curriculum. They didn't know about how you linked quality of course and curriculum and assessment. And so our support to higher education was very much what Tejendra was talking about in one of his slides, which is about we did research capacity training, we did teaching capacity training, and we also did curriculum development training. And we did a few other things beyond that, including warning them about international partnerships where it might not be in their interest, where you had colleagues who were mining data rather than supporting them. If you go to the next slide, this is actually one of our training sessions where we had 11 universities from across the country, many from Yangon, many from Mandalay, but I had insisted on getting some from the sort of fringes, from the ethnic areas as well. And the lady in yellow, who you see, Professor Yin Yin Win, is actually now being looked for. There's the national search warrant out for her because she's part of the protests against the coup and has been organizing academics against the coup. And so if you go to the next slide, those were the good days, just a couple of years ago. These are all the people who took part in the higher education training. These are all rectors and pro-rectors and senior academic staff who were then going to go and start bringing these sort of new ways of working to their universities. And this program actually was meant to continue, but then it ran out of funding. Surprise, surprise. I think something Tejendra mentioned as well. Right, next slide, please. I'm coming to the end. So what I was expecting in 2020 with the elections prior to COVID and prior to the coup was that education would really be seen as a litmus test for judging the success of the reforms. And a lot had been done, but broadly, prior to the 2020 elections, there was a domestic disenchantment with the economy. A lot of the ethnic groups were disenchanted with the peace process, which died under Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership. The international community was disenchanted with Aung San Suu Kyi and the way that she had come to The Hague to try and say that whatever had happened in Northern Rakhine had nothing to do with crimes against humanity. But there was a lack of a credible alternative. And one of the things I need to emphasize here is that the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, obviously was aware of all this disenchantment and certainly expected its party to do a lot better at the polls, which is one of the reasons why we had the coup. The coup happened on the 1st of February. If you go to the next slide, basically, I got a text message at 4 o'clock in the morning, waking me up, saying military coup, one of my friends telling me that this is what was going on. And within days, we saw these images, and you can see they go from being quite positive to the very bad, with lots of people in the streets, the military starting to come in, the police. You can see that nun in Kachin state who's praying for the police not to attack, the tanks arriving in Yangon, and then the shooting starting with people being shot and taken to hospital. Which is after actually the what they call the 4-2 revolution, which is where I have the flag on the left-hand side of the slide. And let's go to my last slide. And this is the role of sort of higher education. So I didn't find a photograph of a Yangon University doing CDM apart from the gate. The gate you see there, this is the gate of one of the main gates of Yangon University. And they have saying basically a sign saying we're closed, we're on CDM, a civil disobedience movement. Monyao University, you can see the entire staff going on strike. And the other 3 pictures are of teachers. Basically the national uniform for teachers is green, a green lungi and a white blouse. And you can see them across various cities here. When they say the education family, in both cases actually where you have the signs, it's not only the green flag and the yellow circle with the triangle, but it's actually not only the teachers, it's also the people who are working in the township education offices and the state education offices, and some people in the ministries are on strike as well. So where we are now is unfortunately, a situation where there's a lot of blood on the streets. I understand on Sunday there were 59 or 60 people killed, another sort of 14 or 15 yesterday. I don't know what the count is today. My suspicion is that when the dust settles, is that because a lot of this was led again by university students, that the universities will either be closed or there will be some form of reckoning with the universities and their staff. Definitely those who've been on CDM will have a difficult career if they still have anything of a career left. It reflects very much what we saw in 1988. I deliberately didn't speak about 1988 because otherwise the talk would have taken far too long, but I'm very happy to answer questions about 1988, where there was similar student uprising against what was in those days not an election, but a socialist dictatorial regime that basically created a massive economic downturn where people didn't have enough money to put food on the table. And that's what the 88 uprising was about. This uprising was about the election being stolen. And on that very unhappy note, you can go to the last slide. Those of the people who are interested can look at the last book, Myanmar's Education Reforms, A Pathway to Social Justice, was just published and is open access. So if you're interested in what was going on for the past decade before the coup, you can download that for free on the UCL website. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. We've got quite a few questions already coming through the chat, and I'd like to remind the rest of you that you are free to enter them as we go. What I try to do when we moderate here is not necessarily to go in order, but to try and sort of group some thematic questions so that we can get to as many of your questions as possible. But I did notice we had a sort of a clarifying question come through, so I thought I might start with that one, just why, while we're on the topic of Myanmar, before going back out to the broader, maybe bringing both of you in. The questions are basically, can you tell us a little bit about the realities of universities on the ground today? Are all universities closed? Does it depend on the institution? And also an impossible question, how do you see the future as of today, Marie?
Right, yeah, crystal ball. No, universities are all shut, and largely also because of COVID. So schools and universities were shut because Myanmar had a very low level of COVID, but just before the elections and just before the coup, the numbers started ticking up. So the institutions, all institutions which were all face-to-face was shut down, and Myanmar doesn't have the kind of capacity to do the kind of online learning that we have been doing. So I know schools have been trying to do things through mobile phones, and it's been quite difficult. But no, universities that were shut and are now definitely 100% shut, given the coup. It's far too dangerous to go from A to B. And I'm sometimes wondering how my friends are getting groceries, because people are getting shot quite randomly on the streets right now. Someone was picking up, a 50-year-old man was picking up trash after a protest. And someone from the 77th Light Infantry Division walked up to him with a gun and just shot him in the head. So it's people are staying at home. Unless there are the protests, they're staying at home. How do I see the the future. I wish I had a crystal ball. It will stop at some point, but it's not. It's very difficult to say what will happen afterwards. Had there been some kind of if it comes through a negotiated position, and if it turns out, if in the end we find that there is a leadership that is willing to sit down with representatives of the current military regime, then the dust could settle and we would probably see the reforms resume in a couple of years, a year or 2 years, probably a roadmap to a new elections where the NLD wouldn't take part. But at the moment, the way it's looking is that it's just confrontation and it's escalation. And the more blood on the streets, the longer it's going to take to recover. And the more the universities are involved and the more the students are involved, the more likely they are to be all those things that were offered in the reforms are going to be taken away. Autonomy, undergraduates back on campuses in cities, which is something which had been taken away in 1988. From 1988 to 2000, I think the universities were shut for a decade and a bit. And all undergraduates were moved onto massive campuses outside of cities so that they couldn't come and protest inside cities. I think we will see similar actions when the dust has settled.
Thank you, Marie. We've got a number of different questions. I think maybe let's start with the first one. So Vichesh Sen brought in a question, and I think this is to both of you. So what should be done so that higher education development in post-conflict or transitional societies is not hijacked by the agendas of donors? So this is something you've both talked about in some sense, but if you could respond directly to it, and maybe Tejendra, do you want to give it a first stab?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't think donors have been hugely interested in supporting higher education in the first place. I think a lot of support is around supporting basic education, and then that goes back to the World Bank reports that George Sekapoulos and other colleagues produced. The rate of return in primary education was way higher than in higher education. So I think that kind of empirical or statistical econometric research, broadly influenced the priorities of donor countries up until early 2000. Then I think there's a growing sort of interest in higher education, but investment hasn't necessarily increased, and donors have not necessarily been transform higher education. What they have really done is to facilitated privatization of higher education. On the one hand, there's growth in the demand for higher education, mostly in conflict-affected context, where people have come back to some sort of normality. Former soldiers, rebel soldiers, coming back to communities, looking for professional development, trying to get access to university. So the demand has increased, but that has been left largely to the private sector, and that's why you see increasing number of private institutions and universities in conflict-affected contexts like Afghanistan, or the place where I worked in Somaliland, are really poor quality higher education institutions without proper facilities or a curricular framework or assessment mechanism, or even trained academics to deliver the curriculum. But I think the real problem is really this idea of a Western model of higher education being exported to these conflict-affected contexts without necessarily facilitating a space to immerse locally and contextually relevant educational provisions. So I think that has become a problem, And this is a kind of cycle of failure that is going to be reproduced over a period of time, because these young people in these contexts, they imagine the model of education to be like Boston College or UCL, over a year or something. And that is not going to happen. They have to start from what the possibilities are and how higher education can relate to local political, economic, and cultural context. And that has certainly been sort of taken away.
Maria, I'd love you to come in on that as well, but let me add an additional question that's sort of related. So it's a question from Ionacho Waldo-Georgis, who says, a common challenge in conflict-affected context is the resource vulnerability. So how can such a system manage its partnerships with the North or relationships with the North? What can it leverage to pursue a more liberated education that does respond to local challenges? I mean, either of you can come in on that, but that sort of adds an additional level to what you were just talking about there, Tejendra.
So a lot of that, the policy borrowing that Tejendra has talked about is a big problem in Myanmar. What we saw when I was there with UCL colleagues, and we were specifically supporting higher education development, was there were rectors who were saying, well, if we're going to do all of this, there's a limited amount of money from the higher education department, from the Ministry of Education, there's going to have to be competition between us. And so we're coming from a situation where everything is funded, so it's basically free, and everything is directed. So the problem is when you move from whatever is fully funded and fully directed to a more open system, costs go up, but funding doesn't. And so the automatic move in Myanmar was to look at, well, what are other countries doing? And well, either they're bringing in like India has, private universities with fees, and public universities operate on a different model, or we operate on a sort of more competitive model, and that's obviously highly supported by the discourse that you have from the development partners, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on and so forth. But the other question of, can you repeat the question on that you added to that?
Just how can less resourced institutions and systems sort of leverage, how can they bargain essentially to make sure that local needs are considered? Or it's sort of another level to the hijack question.
I'll give you an example. So in one of the areas in Myanmar where an ethnic armed group is in charge, which is in northern Kachin state, the Kachin Independence Organization and Kachin Independence Army are in charge, and they control a very thin swath of land. They've been back in conflict with Myanmar. So they had a ceasefire in the early 90s, and they've been back in conflict since 2011. And the Kachin Independence Organization has its own schools. And at one particular point in time when the conflict restarted, they got a little note from the Ministry of Education saying, well, your students from your schools can no longer transfer take the Myanmar matriculation exam and then go to Myanmar universities. We won't accept it anymore. And that had been something which hadn't been formally agreed, but that's something which was traditionally done. And so the Kachin Independence Army said, well, okay, we'll set up our own higher education system. And they have actually across the two cities that they control, Liza and Majayang, and I visited both. They have a nursing college, they have an agricultural college, they have a law college, they have a teacher training institute and an institute of education. That's in Liza, and then in Majayang they have some of the education institute of education is also in Majayang. In Majayang they also got a sort of general kind of Boston College style college, sort of general sort of American style general 4-year sort of BA degree college and the way that they've done this is they've literally asked the community, people Kachin who have been educated abroad, to come and to give their time. It's a little bit like Teach for England, but in this case it's Teach for Kachin at higher education level, and very much bringing in the expertise that some of them have gained in China or in India or in the United States or in the UK or in Canada or wherever they come, and people like me who come in and who help teach them. And that very much is driven within a very high level of conflict, because the gun, actually we're just a few kilometers away from the front line where the Tatmadaw and the Kachin Independence Army are shooting at each other, and you have these sort of colleges sort of churning out graduates behind that front line. But what it shows is that communities are normally the ones who know what they need best, rather than something coming in from the outside, and how a lot of, if you're doing, this are two lessons for me there. One is they knew exactly what they needed and what they wanted, and they had put a network together to bring in this external support. So in conflict affected areas, sometimes that's better than external people coming in who have no idea what they're talking about. But also with regard to nation state building, because actually what Kachin is trying to do is build its own nation state, even if it's on a micro level. Higher education is so critical, because it requires, it requires that sort of higher level of education. You can't just leave school after 10 or 11 or 12 years and then build a country. It just doesn't work.
Thank you, Marie. I'm going to bring in a question from Camille Kandikohausen, in fact. So it's another question for you, Marie, unsurprisingly, since this is a Myanmar question. So what do you see as the future? What do you see the future international relationships with universities and the ministry in Myanmar to be? Do you see that aspect picking up, or more locally based approach? So that's basing off a little bit off your last question. But again, I'm afraid I'm asking for your crystal ball again. But what will that relationship look like in future between international relationships, international universities, and the ministry?
I think given what's happened now, the ministry is going to be under very, very tight scrutiny. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult for higher education institutions to engage in the outside, at least for a few years. I think conservatively estimated 2 years, 3 years, everything will be on hold and on ice. And it could be much longer, because higher education has overstepped the mark. Education as a sector has overstepped the mark in the protests that have been going on. Everyone who's taken part in this, once the dust has settled, will be punished in some way or another. And I cannot see how. I expect that Asian alliances will be supported from Japan, from South Korea, from China, and so on and so forth. But I cannot see how the ministry is going to support higher education connecting to the West in any way. And so, yes, it's going to have, unfortunately, it hasn't gone through enough of the kind of processes that we were trying to engender when you and I were there. Things are what they are. People will pick up the pieces and get on with what they have learned and try and improve things. Generally speaking, that's what's happened. I expect 2-3 years things will be on ice.
I'm going to abuse my position as chair, which you're not really supposed to do, but just I think it would be useful to have your two presentations speak to each other a bit, because Tejendra's presentation ended mapping out some of these possible pathways to impact, right? And of course, what you've been talking about, Marie, was the beginning of a process that was looking like that, and then how it might have gone awry. So I'd like to hear from both of you about how you think your two presentations speak to each other. Is Myanmar exceptional here? Is this a potential lesson learned cautionary tale for many post-conflict contexts? Tejendra, maybe I'll have you come in first, since we haven't heard from you in a little bit, but if you could speak to that piece of it. So, what went wrong here? Is it an idealized pathway that's never going to work, or is there things that could have gone differently that maybe would have ended at a different place?
I guess you need some degree of stability for different partners to be able to work together, especially international partners. I mean, take an example of Syria now. If as a member of Western University, traveling to Syria and working with colleagues in Aleppo is going to be extremely dangerous. And I think Myanmar is probably in a similar situation. Probably an academic from Thailand could possibly go and try to connect with people, more safely than someone from the UK or the US, going out there and then trying to sort of promote of higher education in Myanmar. So I think there are these difficulties there, but I think there's this need for basic level of acceptability by the state of whatever nature. I guess Myanmar is probably not the place where whatever I had actually conceptualized as pathway to impact could be implemented. But I think when things will change, I think they will change, and I can't imagine Myanmar being completely cut off from the international processes of higher education development. It will have to happen. And I think, and that's when these collaborations need to be scrutinized and need to be designed in such a way that there are horizontal ethos and mutual learning sort of opportunities available. But Marie may have a different view.
So I think actually, Tejendra, Myanmar had very much embarked on the framework you were talking about, where you had those 4 windows, with the exception of that last window, which dealt with conflict sensitivity, because Myanmar has basically got 2 main conflicts. It has the NLD, which plus, so NLD plus the students plus now the civil servants against the Tatmadaw, the military. And it has the ethnic armed groups and the ethnic societies against the Tatmadaw. But those 2 are not allied with each other and not aligned with each other. And trying to get into that would be hard, much too complicated. And from an ethnic perspective, the conflict that we have today is just seen as an inter-Burma problem. So, you know, Burma shooting on Burma, because the Tatmadaw is Burma, and most of the people who are in the students are Burma, and the lecturers are Burma, and basically the society on the streets is largely Burma. It's only in ethnic areas that things are slightly different. So we had actually, it started with engaging with higher education institutions across the country, supporting, having put this British Council program together to support exactly the 3 other windows, which was teaching and curriculum development and research support. And this was just a start, because we were starting with the top brass in the universities, but the idea was to then also go into certain universities and support sort of 2nd level academics so that it would actually start to embed. And that obviously is now cut short. And in that sense, Myanmar is exceptional and different. And I'll say it's exceptional and different from other countries in Asia. And I can't speak about Latin America or Africa, but definitely, or the Middle East, but definitely in terms of, like, if you compare it to either Southeast Asia, East Asia, or South Asia, it is quite different in that there is that conflict between the ruling military, and the military was always ruling, even between 2015 and 2020. It always had that core element of the 3 ministries and 25% of the seats in parliament, and society. And in other countries, you would see that the state propagates higher education as part of its path to further development, in particular to have educated graduates to get jobs. This military, the Tatmadaw, has never understood education in those terms. It's only ever understood education in the terms of its adversary. And that's where things are quite different. So if you go and look at universities in Thailand, or universities in Vietnam, or universities in Pakistan, they are not seen as adversaries to the state and the government. And in Myanmar, they are. And that's why it is more complicated in thinking of how things will develop once the dust settles.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Marie. There's lots of questions. I want to be sure we get as many as we can. There was one sort of a broader question. Perhaps this is for you, Tejendra. How do you see the role of higher education in countries such as Colombia, for example, which has been trying to work on demobilizing guerrillas and support former guerrillas reincorporating into society, also to help communities directly affected by conflict to heal and develop? So what do you see as higher education's role in those 2 pieces of post-conflict?
I'm involved in a research project on social movement learning, which involves Colombia as well, and had the opportunity to visit a few universities and also travel to some parts of Colombia. And I think particularly, as the conflict is beginning to transform, of course, there are tensions in relation to, some actors being part of the main and others sort of going away from it. But nevertheless, there is some hope that some young people might want to come back and start more stable life. And the universities can create these opportunities of access in relation to providing professional development training, or creating some exceptional admission framework in welcoming them for some short-term courses and helping them to make progress with the university degrees. And those kinds of things are quite concrete, what normally universities would do in terms of trying to play their role in the post-war peace process, or maybe rehabilitation. But I think there's also another group of universities. Columbia has the tradition of really progressive, popular education being practiced in university spaces, where academics and university students have been at the forefront of the struggle against neoliberal influence on Colombian society, and also resisting the policy reforms that have taken place. So I think there needs to be a very technical and quite directly responsive to the needs of post-war rehabilitation and rebuilding. But then the other one is much more progressive social justice reforms that the university students and academics have been raising. And because Colombia being one of the very unequal societies in the world, I think that's where the universities could play that role in putting pressure for progressive reforms, where the needs of most marginalized communities are addressed through the policies.
Thank you, Tejendra. I think we have time for two more. We have one more quite specific Myanmar question, Marie, if you're happy to take it. And then there's one that I think would be good for both of you to speak to finish up. So the Myanmar question, Marie, is could you comment on China's role in Myanmar's higher education space? And related to that, would not this military regime admire the Chinese top-down approach, given the huge input to Myanmar from the BRI project? If you can speak to China and their involvement.
Sorry, I was on mute. So China is not involved in Myanmar's higher education space. It's slightly involved in Kachin, when I was speaking about the relationship of the Kachin Independence Organization, because they tend to get their doctors trained in Chinese universities, and anyone who's in that sort of a northeastern area, if they're able to go, if they're not accepted into Myanmar universities, and they're in a conflict zone, they tend to go to China, just like in the Northwest, they tend to go to India. But with regard to the actual universities, there are two sets of universities in Myanmar. There are the civilian universities, and there's a set of military universities. So there's a military medical college and a military legal college, and I do not know about the military side of things. Also, it's not there's a maritime college which is run by the Navy. They are not accessible to people like us, ordinary academics from abroad. Never have been, probably never will be, because they train people who are in the Tatmadaw. So I don't know if there's Chinese involvement there, but in the sort of civilian space, Yangon University, Mandalay University, and all the various, so Myanmar has, aside from the universities, has also very specific, it's very much like India, so its technology colleges are separate from the universities, its medical colleges separate from the universities, so they've all been splintered off. So Medicine 1 in Yangon, Medicine 1 in Mandalay, Medicine 1 in Taunji, and so on. Then they have various other universities. There is no Chinese involvement there anywhere. Myanmar does not admire China. In fact, Myanmar has a very strange relationship with China. It's certainly highly dependent on trade with China. Like it's also quite highly dependent on trade with many of the ASEAN countries, but particularly Thailand and Singapore. But it doesn't admire China. In fact, the Tatmadaw sees China, they have a good relationship in terms of diplomatic relations. And they have allowed China to invest and to build a lot of infrastructure, but they are still seen as a kind of enemy, even by the Tatmadaw, even today. In fact, there are some people who've been saying that Aung San Suu Kyi's government was much closer to China than the Tatmadaw was, and I wouldn't say that one is closer than the other. They both know that where they are geopolitically located, they have to have a relationship with China. They accept Chinese investments. But actually, China has nothing to do with the education sector. Japan's much more important in the education sector. Japan has actually sent, I mean, in various technology colleges, you have Japanese professors who have been living there. In the Ministry of Education, there's a Japanese advisor. He's been living there for years. I don't know where he's now. So Japan is very, very involved in both the primary education sector, secondary education sector, and the higher education sector. And that's a very interesting relationship, which I'm not going to get into either.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Marie. And I'm conscious that we're at the hour. I would love to, if you both have 2 more minutes to answer the last question. But for those who are attending who need to leave, just to direct you to the chat, Gerardo kindly posted the link to our next webinar, which is 2 weeks from today. It's a co-sponsored webinar with the International Association of Universities looking at changes in academic publishing, and do join us if you're interested in that. But in the meantime, we'll finish up with the last question that's actually from my colleague Gerardo, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit, Gerardo, if you let me, so that I can have both people speak. So the question was, and this, Tejendra, I'm happy for you to answer this just as it is. Do our speakers have ideas for higher education in context of ethnic conflict about the role that academic staff or faculty members can play to promote justice, especially when the academic staff generally reflects only the ethnic majority? And I will tweak that for you, Marie, because certainly when we think about Myanmar, as you've just said, the ethnic majority is the university sector, and this is less of an ethnic conflict that's happening right now. But perhaps you could speak more generally about the role of academics and faculty in promoting justice, and what we think about in that, and this sort of an environment that we're in today in Myanmar. Tejendra, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, and quite challenging as well, if you are thinking about university's role, the way that we discussed earlier, that to play a much more transformative role, unless there is a political change where inclusion and diversity are recognized, in the states where there is ethnic monopoly, the state power institutions are monopolized by the dominant ethnic groups, and inevitably the higher education institutions and the academic members would be more dominantly from that powerful group, and that's how the hegemonic structures operate. So promoting this idea of
that's good.
Redistribution or representation or recognition, as Nancy Fraser's concepts of social justice. So that is going to be extremely difficult. And that's why in most cases, donor community actually decides to disengage with those kinds of conversations, which could be quite unsettling for those who control power, and the development communities' very existence could be actually threatened if they raise those problematic questions. However, I think I have a great faith in students, particularly because students do not hesitate to ask these challenging questions, and also to experiment new ideas. And if gradually that space for dialogue is actually created, for example, in Myanmar, if at least universities are able to, hold some seminars or discussion fora where ethnic scholars or speakers could actually be welcomed and to be able to share their ideas about their educational vision, their narratives and stories about identity and historical marginalization, I guess that's where the hope for a better change could potentially begin. But in the first place, that is probably going to be very difficult in those circumstances. And there are other contexts as well where there are extremely difficult situations. But over a period of time, I've seen that happen in my own country, Nepal, where the ethnic minorities and marginalized groups, their voice, their ideas were never discussed in the mainstream academic fora. And after like 10, 15, 20 years, after a lot of political upheaval, their voice is increasingly becoming part of the academic and public discourse. So which is actually shaping the broader political discourses in the country and vice versa. So I see that sort of positive change over a period of time.
Thank you so much, Tejendra. Last word, Marie.
Yeah, last word is not going to be that short, I'm afraid, because you've opened a can of worms. So if you go back to what Tejendra was saying about ethnic speakers being allowed into sort of mainstream universities to express their view on marginalization. So as I said, there are two conflicts in Myanmar. One is society versus the Tatmadaw, the other one is ethnics and ethnic armed groups versus the Tatmadaw. And in ethnic states, there are 7 regions which are Bamar majority and 7 ethnic states where there's an ethnic majority, but that doesn't mean that there are no ethnic people living in Bamar majority regions or Bamar living in ethnic regions. It's all quite mixed up. But broadly speaking, because of the education system being only in Burmese, a lot of the young ethnic children whose mother tongue is not Burmese, they will not be, there's this years and years and years of not being able to understand the teachers, a lot of dropouts, and those who do make it through matriculation don't have the kind of grades to get into public universities, and there are no private alternatives. So this is why you have such a discrepancy, even in ethnic states where there are universities that are open to taking ethnic students. There are very few who actually make it in, and we have the same problem with education colleges, which have now become part of the university system where we don't have enough ethnic teachers because they just don't make the matriculation grade. So it's become an invisibility problem. If I speak to my colleagues in Yangon University or even Taunji University, which is the capital of an ethnic state, the capital of Shan State, and I say, you know, there is an issue, the fact that you don't have ethnic students and you're not dealing with the ethnic conflict in Myanmar. They look at me blankly and say, the conditions are the same for all. They're just, you know, they're not good enough or they're not making the cut. And that's why they're not represented here. And there's no, forget the conflict, there's not even an understanding that people who have not been educated in their mother tongue are not able to clear the exams in the same way that those who are actually clearing the exams in the mother tongue. Then the other response you'll get is that there's such a tiny percentage of Myanmar, of actually Burma students make it into higher education, because it's not the vast majority, it's a very small percentage, that they themselves feel that this is a very elitist system and it's quite difficult to get into higher education in the first place. The fact that the conflict is something that could be dealt with in a higher education space is something which is so far off in the future. Even if the reforms had continued as, you know, as they had started, this was not the next thing on the agenda. And there is no recognition of the discrimination against the ethnic groups, which what has fueled ethnic conflict for the last 70 years.
On that highly positive and encouraging, optimistic note, I know it's real. It's the real part of the ideal and the real, right? Yeah. Please join me in thanking our 2 presenters so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for staying 8 minutes over to listen to the last few questions. I appreciate that greatly. As a reminder, do come back to other webinars in the future. We have one in 2 weeks. We have another one in April. We hold them regularly. And if you are not on our mailing list, feel free to send us an email and we'll add you. That's internationalhighered@bc.edu. But thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us.